Let's discuss the Hollywood epic. Can you think of the last movie you saw in theaters that was a so-called Hollywood epic? I can't. Unless we're talking about fantasy CGI fests, most notably the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe like Avengers Endgame and Avengers Infinity War. Or maybe Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, which again is a fantasy. A lot of moviegoers may also point out the Dark Knight trilogy as their most recent epic theater experience. But I never saw those movies in theaters, nor am I here to talk about fictional/fantasy epics. I wouldn't even consider those members of the Hollywood epic genre. See, that's the problem. The only epic movies I can name from the last decade are blockbuster fantasies or superhero movies, all of which are made up entirely, none are remotely real. Nowadays, I feel like people's understanding of what makes a movie a true Hollywood epic is rather, well, should I say lackluster. Because in actuality, the Hollywood epic has disappeared. In 2020, if you ask somebody what their favorite Hollywood epic is, they might say Avengers Endgame. But you see, that's not a real answer. Hollywood epics aren't fictional. They are films based on historical events that took place at some point somewhere on planet Earth. And biblical epics are based on something that may be true. Another way to categorize a Hollywood epic is looking at a film's length. But I must elaborate a little more for those who aren't caught up on what an original Hollywood epic is. There are two kinds of Hollywood epics: biblical and historical. Biblical epics were huge in the 20th century and even made a little comeback in the first half of the 2010s. A few of the notable ones worth mentioning are the Ten Commandments from 1956, Ben-Hur from 1959, The Greatest Story Ever Told from 1965, and The Passion of the Christ from 2004. The latter made over $600 million, and statistics show that if inflation is brought into the equation, the other three films all made somewhere close to $1 billion at the box office. The Ten Commandments, for instance, made over $2 billion after inflation. So yeah, people in the 50s and 60s loved watching biblical epics. As for historical epics, there's a lot more to cover. You can look as far back as Seven Samurai, followed by the films Spartacus, Lawrence of Arabia, Cleopatra, and Zulu, all of which were huge movies when they came out in their respective era. And to this day, people look back at these films as some of the greatest movies of all time. You can't deny that their big budgets and epic scales had almost everything to do with that. I think it's fairly obvious. Like myself, moviegoers in the 1950s and 60s loved watching big-scale movies. Hollywood wouldn't be Hollywood without these films. Epic movies are the reason theaters exist. If it weren't for these original, earth-shattering flicks, movie theaters may not have been around by now. Following the 1960s, Hollywood epics went on a bit of a hiatus, or at least a kind that we're used to watching. From the 1970s and 80s, Hollywood epics formed into modern-ish war movies, focusing on wars that happened between the American Revolution and the Vietnam War. The biggest of these that comes to mind is Apocalypse Now, a 2.5-hour epic that takes place in Vietnam. The 70s, in my opinion, is where modern-ish war movies started becoming really popular. Also gangster films. Some may consider gangster movies epics too. For me, I don't know. When I think of a Hollywood epic, I think of immaculate sets, impressive set pieces, and large-scale battles. Gangster thrillers don't have those. But if you do consider them epics, that's fine. Overall, the 1970s were a tad bit thin for Hollywood epics, but thankfully the 80s delivered more along the way. During the 1980s, films like Gandhi, The Last Emperor, Empire of the Sun, and the biblical epic The Last Temptation of Christ made their way to cinemas, as well as a few other big films. It may not be as impressive of a lineup as the one from the 1960s, but it's still pretty darn good. In all honesty though, I mostly want to talk about the epics that came out in the 1990s and 2000s, because not only are these movies ones I relate to the most since I was born around the time they came out, but they are also more entertaining in my opinion. Starting off with 1992's The Last of the Mohicans. Set during the French and Indian War, Daniel Day-Lewis plays a trapper whose mission is to protect his people and the daughter of a British colonel. It may be a little short for an epic, but don't let the length push you away from watching this classic. On the bright side, if you do hate watching long epics, this could be the perfect Hollywood epic for you considering the 2-hour length. Then there's Braveheart, one of the most popular movies of the 1990s. Okay, the historical inaccuracies are laughable, but as a popcorn epic, it's great. Plus, the 90s also delivered with The Thin Red Line, Saving Private Ryan, and Titanic. The set of that movie was meticulously crafted, and that's why I consider it an epic. And now we're at the 2000s, possibly my favorite decade for epics and movies in general. We start off with Gladiator, truly cinematic and very gory. This is Russell Crowe's best movie in my opinion, with stunning performances from both him and Joaquin Phoenix. Gladiator is a masterpiece unlike any other and is one of the greatest epics ever made. 2000 also gave us The Patriot. I reviewed this movie back in the fall leading up to Midway, and like Mel Gibson's other epic, Braveheart, It has its fair share of inaccuracies historically, and takes a far more formulaic approach. But that doesn't mean this movie isn't entertaining, because hell yeah it is. I still wonder to this day why they don't make more Revolutionary War movies. I don't think I've ever seen one in theaters. Hopefully they can make another epic like The Patriot soon enough. In 2003, Edward Zwick's The Last Samurai was brought to the big screen as the next big Hollywood epic. The end results were quite staggering, for an R-rated movie that is, performing well at the box office, grossing over $300 million in profit. Once again, another masterpiece. The Last Samurai might be Edward Zwick's most touching film. A year later, the epic Troy was released, based on stories from the Iliad and featuring a stacked cast with the likes of Brad Pitt, Eric Bana, Orlando Bloom, Diane Kruger, and Sean Bean. Many people were anticipating an incredibly well-made film. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, as a lot of critics and moviegoers didn't like the movie. But if you ask me, I think it's pretty freaking awesome, even if it's flawed. And that wasn't the last epic we saw Orlando Bloom in the 2000s. He also played the main character in Kingdom of Heaven. Everyone says the theatrical cut is much worse than the director's cut of Kingdom of Heaven. I'll just have to see for myself though, because I've only watched the director's cut, and it was pretty good. Apparently, the theatrical cut edited out a lot of scenes that added to the movie's development of character. Regardless, Kingdom of Heaven is worth your watch. Lastly is 300 from 2006, Gerard Butler's only notable role. I do feel bad for the guy because he deserves better, but always reminds me of a poor man's Russell Crowe. Anyhow, he does have this movie, which is a good thing because it's one of those popcorn epics. You can have a lot of fun with its video game stylized creation. It's shorter for your typical epic, but still has all the genre specifics people love. Now maybe you're wondering why I didn't mention films like the Lord of the Rings trilogy or Avatar. Again, when I think of classic Hollywood epics, I think of films based on real events or something from the Bible, not something completely fictional / fantasy. I mean, Lord of the Rings is epic as anything, and I wish we had more movies like them too, but if we're comparing it to classic Hollywood epics, it falls out of line. So after 2009, there was a large lull for Hollywood epics. And this is still ongoing. Like, for the longest time, there really hasn't been any epics that stand out as good, or at the very least, watchable. In 2010, there was Robin Hood. I bet you Gladiator fans couldn't wait for this one, and what do you know, everyone hated it. The film nearly bombed at the box office. Russell Crowe then starred in yet again another epic, this time biblical, titled Noah. Oh god, audiences despise this movie. I somewhat liked it, and critics did too. But audiences, nope. I think movie fans just hate Darren Aronofsky movies. Okay, what else? Well, there are a few more box office bombs. Exodus, Gods, and Kings from 2014. Entertaining, yes, but well received, absolutely not. Which is a shame. Ooh, can't forget about Gods of Egypt. It's known as an embarrassment to filmmaking and is offensive to those who actually like what it's based on. Ah, sorry Gerard. And what about the Ben-Hur remake? Oh man. Both of those films came out in 2016. 2017 and 2018 we didn't see much of anything in terms of Hollywood epics. And the only movie from 2019 I can think of that follows the Hollywood epic route is Netflix's The King, which is a pretty good movie and it should not come as a surprise considering the talent involved. But what sucks about it is how it went straight to Netflix. Maybe if they promoted it a little more and brushed up on the script to make the first half as entertaining as the second, it may have done damage at the box office. And that pretty much covers it. There's nothing else, unfortunately. I'll explain why. Why has there not been a truly successful Hollywood epic since 300? Answer number 1. Money. These movies require massive budgets and a ton of work, but if your film doesn't perform well at the box office, it may not have been worth all the time and money, in their eyes at least. So why take a chance with making one of these films when you've already seen a trend that's been going on since 2010 with epics? And that's that nobody cares to see them anymore. That doesn't include me, but I'm not an average moviegoer. I'll dive a little deeper into that point in just a second. That leads me into answer number 2. The R rating isn't mainstream. This is a huge problem all kinds of movies face. People didn't know how well Joker would perform at the box office because of its R rating, and it turns out it did great, but that's one exception. Most R-rated movies don't make a tremendous income theatrically. You see, having a PG-13 rating is perfect because anyone of any age can go see it, and the creative team can get away with a decent amount, I'll bet sometimes a little too much. However, R-rated movies are very different from PG-13 films. They can show just about anything, but kids won't be able to watch, and for some, it may be too graphic, which is certainly a sad reality for Hollywood epics because the ones that aren't rated R aren't as good. Just imagine a PG-13 Gladiator or Braveheart. That wouldn't be good. And sure, you can still make great movies if you tone down on the violence, but if you're trying to make the best epic as possible and you are limited creatively, directors won't take on the project. That then allows me to bridge the gap between the first two answers and answer 3. My third answer is, other popular genres exist. When I say other popular genres, I mostly just mean superhero movies. Those have unfortunately taken over Hollywood and are known as the breadwinners in modern day. Think about it, what came out just 2 years after 300? A little movie called Iron Man, the film that made it very clear that superheroes are the best way to go. Once everyone saw how successful superhero movies can be, they all hopped on the bandwagon. It is true, superhero movies do make the most money, even when they stink. Most average movie fans rather watch another generic superhero film than a blockbuster Hollywood epic. Out of the top 12 highest grossing movies of all time, 5 of them are Marvel movies alone. It's become pretty clear that this is not the 1950s or 60s anymore, when films like The Ten Commandments or Ben-Hur ruled the box office. Times have evolved at the movies just like so many other things have. For fans of Hollywood epics like myself, that's a bad thing. We may never see another true epic, at least not for a while. Instead, we'll be treated to more MCU and DC movies. And that's exactly why the Hollywood epic is dead. Directors rather put their time, money, and effort into something that's guaranteed to make a large profit. Until times evolve once more, we'll probably be stuck with superhero movies as the box office sweetheart. My hope is that eventually we can get at least one more great classic Hollywood epic in my lifetime. Just one. I know there are plenty of incredible historical stories that haven't been told yet on the big screen, so maybe they'll get their time to shine in the future. Enough is enough with this superhero crap. I'm over it. Of course though guys, I want to hear what you think. Is the Hollywood epic dead? And if so, are there any historical tales you'd like to be made for theaters that hasn't been made yet? Let me know down below in the comment section guys. As always everyone, if you're new to my channel, click the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Thank you all so much for watching this video, and I hope you all have a very fantastic day.